Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched A Better Tomorrow 2 from 1987. So, after last week's reflection on A Better Tomorrow 1 and a number of other movies that I've watched, including Hard Boiled, I felt it was only right to go straight into this one. This is a fascinating one. I'm going to suggest, if you haven't already, do watch last week's episode. Otherwise, this one, well, I'm going to reference it directly. So it may make slightly less sense without the context. A Better Tomorrow 2 is interesting for a whole bunch of reasons. It is closer to what I actually expected when I went into A Better Tomorrow 1. There are a lot of elements of it as a John Woo film that are much more consistent with my expectations of, one of his earlier productions. This is a film that, compared to the first one, is much more bombastic and chaotic, and much closer to something like Hard Boiled, while still not having as refined of a style. In fact, it's hard to decide. It's all, it's comparing very qualitative assessments, but there are elements of the first film that I think are much more representative or much more directly exemplify Woo's strengths and trademarks than this one does. However, all of the elements that are present in this one, or are present in the first one, are also present in this one. It's just that this one goes ahead more with the over-the-top stylistic approach that something like Hard Boiled has. A lot of the comparison between these two movies is pretty directly similar. This is a direct sequel of sorts, and most of the main characters from the first film reprise their roles in the second film. Minor spoilers for the first and second film, but I've forgotten his name. Chow Yun-fat, who dies at the end of the first film, is back in this film, just playing his twin brother, who there is no mention of in the first film. You probably already knew that because, well, depending on which cover art I use, he's on the cover. And something I didn't totally realize when watching the first one is that the first one was really a breakout role for him more than I knew. He had been in the industry for 10 or more years, I think, at that point. But that was a big breakout role for him. And what's all the more fascinating is, despite the fact that that was a very successful film for him, and this one was reasonably successful as well. And I think he's also in the third one, which I'm not going to watch because apparently it's truly awful and directed by somebody else. Apparently he really didn't like doing the sequel or sequels. Basically said in interviews that he was appreciative of John Woo and their close friends, and obviously he did a whole bunch of other movies with him later. But that reprising a role and doing the same role over again he really dislikes that. That's not to say that he just directly reprises the role completely. I'm making fun of it a little bit. Because yes, they do just bring him back as his own brother. But the brother's characterization is somewhat different. Not hugely different. It's definitely a lot of the same, kind of hard character that Chow Yun-fat often plays, But it's different enough that it's not completely silly. That said, overall, he and many of the other characters as well, but to a lesser extent, chew on the scenery of this film with reckless abandon. Compared to the first movie, which is relatively subdued, as I mentioned, and really lacks a lot of the chaos with the exception of a few action scenes. This one is very much like it's, like 80% of the way to the hard boiled level of chaos. There are more action scenes. They are more extended, more bombastic, more people in them, more shootouts, more guns, more bullets flying, more squibs, more people dying. To the point of absolute absurdity, where it's just like five guys falling through a single doorway and taking bullets as they do. It's fantastic in a very cheesy way that I'm not entirely sure is supposed to be cheesy. But I have to imagine is not unintentional either. Getting a read on the tone of the film is very weird, because it wavers between violent, hilarious absurdity and yet has a whole bunch of elements of a more dramatic film, more like the first one. My understanding is that this was co-produced by is it Sui Hark? Anyway, apparently there were some substantial disagreements between John Woo and Sui Hark about what the narrative of the film was supposed to be. I didn't know that watching it, but now it makes a lot more sense, because the through line narratively is way more of a mess. While the first one is of questionable quality in terms of how compelling it is and how deep the characters are and how much you care about the narrative as it goes on, it is fundamentally pretty streamlined and pretty easy to follow, even if it's shallow. This film, by comparison, has more complexity. Whether or not it gets any more depth it's a little up in the air, but it's definitely more confusing. There are more through lines to the story. There are branches of the story that seem to split off for no apparent reason, reach levels of insanity, and not in the pleasant, John Woo action film kind of way, but just sort of like nervous laughing, like, what are we doing here? Why is this happening? On a couple of occasions. And then they eventually meander their way back into the core story. And so by the end of the film, which is only, it's like an hour and 40 minutes or something like that, really feels like a longer film, because it's kind of so all over the place structurally. There are many things that go completely without explanation, or with very limited explanation, brushed under the rug for the sake of progressing the narrative, because the whole thing does move at a good clip. Despite the feeling of it being longer than it is, it doesn't really have a pacing problem, other than the fact that there's a point at the film where it basically branches off into two completely separate potential films, and then for some reason reconvenes, rather than, you could have made the first chunk of this film the same and then made two completely separate films, but narratively it doesn't come together cleanly, that's for sure. And now that I know about the writing and production arguments, that makes all the more sense. Um, it's like the chewing at the scenery stuff really does it some good. It's not all like it's not all great acting, but it is very entertaining. Um, there are definitely there are some scenes in the first one that I think are probably better um, quality wise than in this one. Um, uh, and as I mentioned before, I think go to exemplify Wu's strengths better. But there are so many more great scenes in this one, and they tend to last so much longer, and they're not even all action scenes either. Um, uh, and they're sort of sprinkled throughout really pleasantly that it's easy to drown out some of the weak narrative issues with some of what's in here. Um, there are a couple of extended scenes that are really solid as action and like levels of absurdity and borderline comedy that I think are great. There's also some great tense scenes, um, sort of in the early to middle portion that I think work really well. I'll just say that the eat the rice scene is great. I love it. Um, but that does bring me to another point, which part of the film includes a substantial amount of like native English speaking characters, except they were either directed or dubbed with such absurd levels of they're so over the top. I don't mean like they turned it up to 11. I think like they turned it up to like 23. Uh and it's just so weird. It's interesting as a comparison to interpretations of American both like American culture in general and also American representation as viewed by foreign viewers of Hollywood films. Um, that's a common thing. That's not an uncommon thing, especially in Hong Kong action cinema. But um, I, it's not in this movie. It strikes me as different. It is not just a matter of an outsider's perspective on the absurdity of American machismo. It's more of a like a deliberate satire at times. And the eat the rice scene in particular, I think, exemplifies it. The way the scene kicks off is just chef's kiss. Beautiful. Absolutely wonderful. And the way it comes to a close is likewise so goofy yet satisfying that you can't help but love it. Unfortunately, overall, I don't think I'm struggling to decide whether I like the first or second movie better. They're both weaker than Hard Boiled, I think, for their own reasons. The first one presents a more cohesive narrative, but has less defining traits that are actually interesting. This one is an absolute mess that really only salvages itself by virtue of the absurd, hilarious, over the top, bombastic scenes that permeate it much more thoroughly. And so I don't know whether I can like really strongly recommend either one or give you a hard answer on which one I think is the better film. I think as a narrative whole, the first one's probably better. As an entertaining experience, the second one is probably better. They both struggle visually. I talked last time about the first movie and the sort of production quality and things like that. And this one doesn't get dramatically better, and it doesn't get dramatically... Well, it doesn't get dramatically better. I don't think it really gets worse. But it does not, like, suddenly jump to a new level of quality, even after the great success of the first one. There's definitely places where more money was spent. There's more, when you get some money and you're making a over-the-top action film, you're probably going to spend some of it on, pyrotechnics and explosions and things like that. And that is very apparent that they had more of a budget for those production effects. Likewise, I think I don't actually know what film. I haven't been able to find any information about what cameras or film was used for the two films. They do look rather dramatically different, and while the first one, I think I mentioned, has some definite issues with scenes that are overly dark and hard to read visually, this one doesn't have that issue, but is not particularly prettier. It still feels relatively low budget, and while some of the cinematography seems more deliberate and more willing to go, that extra mile to do something crazy or unique or effective in its framing, the quality of the print that comes out, while not having that lighting issue so much, also isn't like particularly visually appealing. I don't know. This film is, was made in or came out, I think, just over a year after. I mean, there's 1986 to 1987. And so it's not, and budgets in Hong Kong action cinema in the 80s were not super high, but it's just not, it certainly doesn't have the level of visual polish that Hard Boiled does. And Hard Boiled still struggles sometimes with its film quality and some lighting issues is my recollection. But it's definitely not nearly as strong as that, though it is a step up. There are some bizarre edits, both in the audio. There's a particular section near the end of the film where audio is very oddly edited. I have to assume it was a deliberate artistic choice, and I think I know what they were going for, but it's implemented in such a weird way with the elements that they choose to filter in and out for cinematic effect and focus that, in addition to the ongoing issue of like very extensive ADR being slightly odd, the mix down is it's very noticeable. If you're going to do audio effects and selective, non-diegetic audio filtering and things like that, then you try and do it as unobtrusively as possible. Where in this case, it just kind of straight cuts out at certain points. But the audio editing isn't the only thing. There's also quite a few odd cuts. And the one that sticks out to me, there's one particularly bad cut where Chow Yun-fat's character goes to smash a window with a gun, and it cuts to the next scene before the window smash happens and you hear nothing. It's so weird. And while that's like the most jarring one by a hell of a lot, there's definitely more than a few places where it's just like, oh, I think you guys need to clean up which frame you were slicing this on, or, those sorts of things. But that gets to the overall production cost and quality as well. Yeah. As a sequel, I don't know that it's that strong. It certainly doesn't take a really good, well, it doesn't have a good reason to exist, but I'm not upset for it existing either. It's hardly the worst thing one could watch from the genre or the time or any such thing, but it's definitely got some substantial flaws, especially in the overarching narrative department. That said, if you have, 100 minutes to spend on something cheesy and over the top and are like can stomach some of that roughness for the sake of some of the things that are good, I think it's solid. Well, it's interesting. It's rough, but it's definitely interesting. I think my only closing thought is, why does Ken have so many oranges? Why? If you've seen the movie, let me know why you think Ken has so many oranges. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.